Fundamentals of Mixing, lesson number 11, gain structure of a mix. Let's go right off to Pro Tools here and get straight at it. Fundamentally, there are areas where dealing with or managing gain structure is probably one of the most important things to maintaining some integrity and balance in your mix and in your mix work. The reason for this is that when you're working, and all of this stuff stems back through all of mixing, you have to understand, and it's not something that you can just sort of arbitrarily throw out because it's DAW and you got 64-bit processing and you're never clipping and blah, 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 blah. You can deal with things on that level, but you end up making things more difficult very quickly. So I want to talk about some of the ways that you can manage some of these things and how to be very conscious of your gain structure as you're going through. And then I'll kind of make some details, and then we'll talk about the individual aspects of it. So when we're talking about gain structure, the starting place for gain structure comes from working with your individual audio tracks. So as you're analyzing and looking at audio tracks, quite often, and what is the case with this particular production, is that we have our files, audio files, that are probably close to maxed out in gain. In this case, because there are loops and samples and things like that, it's easy to do. Generally, when you work with live performances, there is there's a dynamic response that you can only compensate for by being conservative with your input gain. So in other words, if you're recording a vocalist, generally you kind of, if you're properly recording them, you want to find out what the maximum they're going to output in terms of how loud they're going to sing for that particular song. Kind of judge what the lowest end of it is, and you can usually get this as they're running through the performance. And then what you try to do is try to give yourself enough headroom so that you're never clipping the analog conversion stage to digital. And so on that end, you're kind of dealing with it from there. Once it's in the box, though, you can actually manage the gain of individual words and phrases and things like that. And you can take control of that. When you're dealing with electronic music, usually it's programmed, it's sequenced, it's quantized, all of those things. So if you have a kick drum that's just sort of pulsing through a track, as is the case in this particular song, then just a 4 on the floor type of thing. It's the same sample, it plays over and over again, and it's always going to be at the same level. So there you can it's very easy to manage. And what happens in those cases is people will quite often try to take full advantage of the extra bandwidth and kind of crank the gain up. Now, the problem with that is that when you get to the processing end of things, it's not so much that the computer can't handle it, because if you're pretty much unless you're stuck on a 32-bit system, if you're working in 64-bit, essentially what ends up happening is inside the box, all plugins in a 64-bit architecture will be able to handle levels that go beyond what would convert your analog conversion stage at the output, your digital to analog, your DAC. And as long as you get the gain down below that prior to that stage, you shouldn't get clipping. Now, you have to go plugin by plugin because not all plugins function that way. And in particular, where it becomes apparent is when you're dealing with analog plugins. Analog emulations are actually created at particular levels. And the gain structure of analog gear is always at a what would be called a +4 line level, which amounts to more or less about 1.23 volts. And when gear is calibrated, it's optimized for working at that particular level. The problem when entering the digital realm, and whenever you interface analog world and digital world, when you go through a converter, there is also a level stage or a gain staging. And I want to talk a little bit about this because this sort of plays into everything else that we're going to do here. So let me just pull that aside for a second. And call up a page. So what ends up happening is you have an audio gain that's coming in and it's running through an ADC, right, an analog to digital conversion stage. And then you have the digital realm, so it'll record on the hard drive, it'll be processed, all of that, all of the DAW type of stuff. So I'll just put DAW in here. And then in order to listen to it, it's going to have to go through a DAC, a digital to analog conversion stage, which then goes out and feeds your speakers and all of that, so you can monitor it. So in this inner world here, there really there are limits in terms of the gain, but it's just about how you manage it. This is where we're going to focus most of the energy. The way that this works, and you may have seen things where you see, oh, this is a minus 20 standard, or oh, this is a minus 18 standard, or this is a minus 12 or minus 14 standard. So it's important to understand what that means on the recording side, because unless you're operating with a professional rig, and when I say professional rig, like if you're operating with a USB interface, that is, a self-powered USB interface, like it's powered by the USB bus, you're dealing with something that's already pre-calibrated for you. If you're dealing with more high-end professional interfaces, there's a calibration point. It sometimes shows up as a tweak pot. Sometimes the software, the internal software that actually operates the hardware, you can actually control the input-output gain staging. And the reason why you would want to do this and the way that you calibrate it is based on how much headroom that you want to have when you're recording into the ADC. So the way that that ends up working is that if the music is not very dynamic and you don't need a lot of headroom, you set your input gain to minus 12. So what that means is that that plus 4 line level signal is going to be equal to minus 12 to minus 12 on your peak meter. So when you're actually looking at the input gain stage, that's what it's going to show up as. So usually it would be like a 1 kilohertz sine wave at that 1.23 volts line level comes in, and it shows up at minus 12 on the meter. Now, what happens is that passing through there and going to the DAC, this also has to be calibrated to minus 12 or compensated to the same level. So in other words, if you bring up the input level, you're going to end up bringing down the output level to compensate so that it shows up at that same plus 4 level on the analog side. And this is what is called unity gain. It's a principle that has always applied for all mixing and for all audio work. So this is like a this is the structure of mixing in all recording, is working with unity gain. So in the analog realm, for the most part, when you're going through any piece of analog gear, you're going through equalization, you're going through compression, you're trying to manage the output gain so it's essentially pretty close to the same as what the original is. Now, not all EQs have an output gain control. In fact, most of them don't in terms of outboard. They don't on an analog console. Some compression, like if you look at an SSL compressor as an automatic makeup gain, you don't have the control. So the only control that you have is on the fader. When you're working with plugins, a lot of them have output level controls, especially on compressors. And so you're always trying to manage the output of those compressors so that with the gain reduction factored in, when you take the unit in and out, you can actually properly judge whether the compression is giving you what you want or the EQ is giving you what you want, because it's very easy to be fooled by the amount of overall level of what's going on. So so for less dynamic music, a minus 12 or a minus 14 standard might be appropriate. For like classical or jazz or more dynamic music, minus 20 is appropriate. They bring down the analog amplifier stage before digital conversion to allow for those peaks in the performance. So these are actual musician dynamics. Okay, so the musician playing harder, playing more forcefully, than going to a very quiet thing. These are things that you see a lot in classical and jazz. And a lot of other forms of music exhibit these dynamic range capabilities. Sometimes it's just the inconsistency of a vocalist. You want to have that extra headroom. But on the output stage, if you bring the input gain down, you bring the output gain up to match again, so you end up at plus 4 going through this and ending up back at plus 4 on the opposite end. So the gain structure that goes on internally becomes important mostly because of analog emulations and also managing the gain in your mix bus. So let's kind of take a look at where the gain stages are. So first thing that we look at is just basic loops and things like that. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up a meter here. So let's just see here. I think I had like, hold on. Yeah, okay. There we go. Okay, so here I just have a Klanghelm VU meter. VU meters, I like using VU meters, and maybe because I do so much analog processing in the box. In other words, just working with analog emulations. I like to set up my gain structure accordingly, so when I start to run through those pieces, I'm getting the way that they're optimized. Analog gear is all optimized for working with +4 line level signals, so that if you're feeding a bass, you're feeding a vocal, you're feeding a snare drum, a kick drum, as long as it's operating within those basic realms of gain and voltages, when it passes through that piece, whether it's an EQ, whether it's a compressor, whether it's a gate, or whatever the form of processor it is, when you feed that in, that piece of gear is calibrated and optimized for working with signals within that range. So if you feed something in that's 20 dB too low, then you're not going to get the optimal results out of that LA2A. You're going to end up turning the peak reduction way up, and now you're going to get a very different response from the way it was optimally designed. If you're bringing that like with 20 dB too much level into that same unit, now you're way overloading it. And now you're bringing in other harmonic distortion aspects that may not be necessarily pleasing, or you start to lose control from it. Now this is set up to a -18, and that's more or less kind of a standard way of working. You can change the calibration on this. The thing about a VU meter, and this is important, is a VU stands for volume unit. It's a weighted device, meaning that the frequency response is weighted in such a way that the VU meter more or less is designed to represent our perception of volume rather than the actuality of it. So in other words, the VU meter is going to be slow on transient peaks. So if you put a cowbell in here, an appropriate level on the VU meter may be -15 or even -20 or -10 at its as its optimal level. And the reason for this is that the transient peak is so sharp and so far away from the RMS signal, that's the cowbell or a clave or something like that, that the VU meter is going to show up very low because it's going to give you an average of signal over time. And when you listen to it, it will sound very loud even though the VU meter is low. When you deal with more on the other side of things, if you deal with very RMS heavy instruments like basses, where the initial transient is fairly soft, especially relative to the sustain of the note. So if a note is held, what will happen is that VU meter going up to 0 will be a very accurate representation of that. So VU meters, when you're bringing levels up on most things, the more sustaining they are, the more you're going to be pushing the level or seeing the level up in that -3 to 0 range. It can go above it a little bit, it can go a little bit lower. You know, you're allowing for natural dynamic within the performance. You're never going to make everything. In other words, you don't want to take each track, go through it, take every bit of every performance and balance it all out so everything's at 0, okay? Because that defeats the purpose. You don't want to ruin the musicality of the instrumentation of whatever it is that you're working with. The idea of this is that it gives you a way of adapting the gain staging so that as you start running through vintage pieces of gear, you're going to get optimal results with the way that it works. So if I listen to this particular beat here, let me just cue up a little bit. Right, so this is already, you could see that it's way too heavy, and I could see just by looking at here on the peak meter that it's already showing up at 0. So that's the DBFS scale. I was sort of vegging out on that here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this down. I'm just going to guess like probably around like -6, and let's just see what that looks like. All right, so still too heavy. Probably going to bring it down maybe closer to -10. Let's just see what that looks like. All right, so that's a little bit more representative of where I kind of want this. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing here because this is going to be somewhere around that same thing. So you might say like, well, why -10? Why wouldn't it be -18? Because this is still showing peak signals, right? There's a transient there, especially these are percussion loops. So you are seeing some, so maybe what I'll do here, I'll just kind of move this down. Right, so I'm creating some general starting places. I also have another loop here. These all happen to be stereo loops, so this is actually going to be pretty easy. So this is a little bit deceptive because there is more RMS energy in there, and that peak signal. Let me just see something here. Just reset this. So there are some peaks in there. I'm actually going to back this off. Probably not as much. Maybe I'll just go to -3 here, get kind of like a decent average. Like you could see that there's a peak going on here with that one thing. So I don't necessarily need to suffocate the rest of it or bring the level down too low, but I'm going to kind of stay with that, and we may adjust it as we kind of go along here. Let me call up the same, and there are meters. I happen to like this one. This is actually a very good one. I like it. It also has some calibrated settings. You can make adjustments in terms of the gain. So if you're working, you could set it to peak metering and see the peak levels. You could set it to VUs. They actually made VU style meters that showed peak where the top number was 0, and you would see numbers set up off of that. And what would happen is it would respond to the peaks, but it would have a very slow recovery. So you could basically see on the needle what that looked like. I'm not sure that that's like necessarily like a big help. So let's for this, but right. So there you kind of see there are some phrases that are kind of jumping up above here, but basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at the levels here with the bass, because it's a very active bass. It's just kind of a funky bass. Now, as this mix goes along, I may view some of that stuff, and it may not be a problem, or I may need to go in and kind of adjust those gains for those sweeps. In this type of case, in the recording stage, there would usually be some form of compression to kind of help that along with the process. So let's just step up here. All right, so what I'm going to do here is just bring this down by another dB, kind of get that like at 0. If you're on a particular see, now here's something where you could see like there's like a peak. Let's just see what this is like at -6. Let's see what that's like. So usually, you know, it's not uncommon for like a snare or like particularly for a clap to have it like at -6 or something along those lines here. Let's just see where we're at with the snare drum. Where, you know, some people would do this where they would actually have the snare drum, depending upon how much body is in the snare drum, they may have it up closer to 0, and that would be, like on an analog tape, would be good for getting some tape compression aspects going on. And let's just see here. You know, again, this is like a pretty decent level here, like for something like a tambourine, which would have a sharper transient. So let me just kind of move my way down here, go to the rim shot. See, like right there, you could see like that's at -7. You could see the peak light going on. Now, normally just like not talking through this, you know, and I don't want to, you know, make this into like this whole huge exercise where everything you do is like you can't, you know, you end up spending 6 hours just trying to balance everything. This is something that you could just kind of do as you're going along. So it's not necessarily this, it doesn't have to be this long, drawn out process. But if you're, you know, if you have a meter like this and it does have some kind of peak line, this has like a yellow peak and then a red peak, which it would indicate that it would be over if you're using a -18 system. So that's kind of like a good guide. So I'm just moving. This is just on the first plug-in slot. See, like this is an example like here with the stick. Like, watch as I start to, let's see how far I have to push up, right? So you can see it there. It's already red. The idea of this then is that I'm kind of preparing or pre-preparing. I'm just going to set that at like a -3 or adding +3. Let's just go to the hi-hat here and just see. Hi-hat's another one that, again, is going to be... So there's a difference here. There's a variation here. Now, this ends up being a mixed thing where... let me just suspend my groups here for a second. Oh, there's actually a closed and open hi-hat. Okay, so... But when I come out of one of these guys into the next... Right, this level relative to the other... is too low. So in other words, I want to have this so it's kind of balanced, unless... Like, the perception of this is that it's much lower in level, and usually that's not something that you want. So let's just see. I may end up having to bring the overall gain down here, but... So maybe on the overall gain, I could pull this back just a little bit, maybe a couple dB, and then come back here and bring this up so that the balance here is basically pretty even. Now, again, this is something that, you know, may not necessarily be... let me just see here if I can... It may not be something that's necessarily that... how much did I make this? Oh, +3. Wow, okay. That seemed to be like too high. Let me just see here if I get this. I want to make this so that it's very clear, you know, that as I'm working from thing to thing, I want it to work consistently through whatever processing. Like, I may end up in all of this moving that over to like another track and managing it that way. You know, the open hi-hat, or that the softer hi-hat versus the stick hit hi-hat. So it wouldn't be uncommon to have like a hi-hat there with peaks at like -12. There's like enough transient energy in there. Let's see what else we got. And let's see, let's just see what that looks like. Right, so you could see there how, and this may be a little bit trickier because of here. So if you look in the lower left of that region, you'll see like a metering. So I'm going to bring it down 6 dB, like you see right there. Right, and that's okay. You know, I could kind of bring that up. I'm not sure why that's so low. There may be a reason for that in the mix, so I'm going to kind of hold off on that just yet. I want to see what the peak level looks like on this this key build, or this. All right, so that's fine. That's like a reverse kick build. Kick drums can usually go up higher towards that realm. Let me just kind of work my way up here. All right, just like a little bit on the loud side here. So this, it's, of course, it's pure insanity, because that's what I love to get into. I love to get into a bit of detail just so you kind of understand what this is all about. All right, so that's okay, but I want to leave like plenty of headroom here on some things. So just quickly looking at some of this stuff without getting into like a whole big, you know, long super mapped out thing. Like, just those look okay. So we'll just kind of step up the process here and just see what this is like. All right, that looks good. All All right, so this is a little bit heavier on the level, so maybe I'm going to pull this down a couple of dB here, and then so that yellow LED is not coming on. That'll give me like a good balance point. Let's just see here. I got this other stereo view. Let's see if I can drag this guy down here. It's taken us all this time to get to another stereo track. All right, so pads should be like really reasonable with regard to this. So let's just see what we got here. Helps if you look at it. I'm just gonna back off like a dB there. Oops, maybe a little more. And this is like, the reason why I'm getting into this prior to other stuff that's going on is that this is going to allow me to gain stage everything else. Sometimes the waveform envelope is a little deceptive. All right, so let's just see here. So those are more sustained. Let's see. Oh, I'll bring that up to +3. It's even got the click of the bow noise in there. That's when you know you have a good sample library. Alright, I'm gonna bring that down a couple dB. Just that attack there on that. Here, what I'm gonna do here with the tracks is I'm going to hide aux tracks here for a second. All right. So on some of these tracks, I've pretty much balanced out the gain for what I'm, from section to section. You can see where this is pushing it though, because that, that synth part. So I'm also keeping an eye on that peak meter to kind of give me a little bit of a gauge or a guide for what to do. And I'm going to move these guys here. And this is a little bit trickier here because we have the lead vocals. So let's just kind of take a look at this.
It's enlightening who we are. Don't have a manual, but together we can use start. We are standing.
Now I'm going to see what it looks like here.
Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are.
All right, so I can see here where
Trusting who you are, no stopping, ain't no stopping.
I'm going to get this so it's
ain't no stopping, that's just
so it's running
who we
at 0 more or less.
Trusting who you are, no stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no
more or less
stopping,
peaking
that's
at
just
0.
Who we are. Trusting who you are, no stopping, ain't no stopping. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are.
And then let's just take a look here.
It's enlightening who we are. Don't have a manual, but together we can use start.
So there's going to be some peaks over, which is okay.
Just feet apart.
And then we have a background comp. All right, so we're right near the end here. And then let's just see here what we have.
When your legs start to give up on you, still run the race.
All right, so
yeah,
back this
it's
up.
just what we have to do to just claim the fame.
Bring that back a couple dB.
That's who we are. Ain't no stopping, that's just who we are. Trusting who you are, no stopping, ain't no stopping.
All right, and then one final thing over here, and then we'll put a wrap on this. Helps if I At least 3 dB.
No.
That's also affected by the fact that it's kind of filtered down. Let's see what it sounds like over here.
Ain't no stopping or trusting who you are, no stopping.
So if I'm doing this, you know, in terms of preparing for the mix, a lot of these things I'll do as I'm analyzing the tracks. So if I see that overall level things are out of balance, I'll just kind of do like overall changes. Like there was something that happened over here where there's like a clap or something. Like there's this one sample that actually should be divided out onto a separate track, and then I think I did actually bring the gain, just to kind of compensate for it, just as a way of, you know, I think I brought it down like 9 dB, and that probably should end up on a separate track. And probably will end up doing that for the mix. But the idea, though, if I'm doing this as I kind of go along, you'll see that some tracks look louder than what they are. You know, just like the waveform doesn't always necessarily conform to anything. You have to look at the transient nature versus like you could see here, there's more transient nature here. It's going to show up lower on the VU, maybe -10, -7 as peaks on things like that. Things like hi-hats, more sustaining instruments, are going to be closer to the -3 to 0 range and kind of working with there. So it was very cool. Now you can actually do this working with like an LUFS meter or something like that, which also manages gain. They also have VU ballistics in it. You could set up the ballistics of your application so that, you know, when you're actually, I believe there's a shortcut way of doing this. That's the one way with the meter. Can't remember if it's a right click on it or something, or maybe you have to go into the preferences. There's a way to set up the metering so it shows particular different scales, showing you, most of the time it's just set up for DBFS. Sometimes it'll give you somewhat of a VU ballistic, or what they call like a digital VU, that type of thing. And you can kind of manage it that way and go through with the metering. I guess I'm kind of used to working with VU meters, and so there's a little bit of an eye component. So if you don't completely understand it, kind of work with it from as best you can from that perspective. Every analog piece of gear, almost all of them will have a VU meter that's showing. So a lot of times when people call up, say, an 1176, and I'll just do so like very quickly just to kind of show you something here. So if I just call up a CL76, you know, they never set it to show input and showing the input gain and the output gain, and as they just set it to show gain reduction. And so this is something that, you know, you could see here on the actual original piece. It doesn't go like this. So this is, I'm not sure if this is showing like more of a peak scale than like a VU scale, but on the gain reduction here, you see more of a VU style meter. So that may be worth checking out, like the manual or something like that, to get an idea of what's going on. So just to go through to the next stage real quick, what I want to do is I'm going to bring up, I got my master fader, so let me bring back some of my stems here and just go through one other quick thing, just as like a quick demonstration. So all I'm going to do here is just bring up drums and show you like some quick gain structure stuff. When we're working with certain things, like let's just say that we're doing like an EQ, all right? So let's just say, for example, I'll call up an EQ, like this VEQ4 or something like that. Now, whether you're working with a digital EQ or an analog EQ, that's not necessarily the point here. But let's just say that I have some filtering going on here. I'm going to boost some stuff. So let's just kind of play around with this and with the drums and do. And kind of adjust some gain. Especially when you work with analog gear, the tendency will be to boost more because there are harmonic distortion components you get by kind of driving the input electronics and output transformers. But unlike the original pieces, a lot of times output gains are added So if I don't adjust or compensate for this, what ends up happening is I get a misjudgment here. So like if you see here, I've brought the gain down just about 3 dB. So just to show you what that difference is, if I keep it because of the amount of gain that I added. So now if I keep it a normal gain output, it's just going to sound louder, which is always going to sound better. So I'm not really clear about whether the EQ is giving me the difference or whether it's just a gain thing, a volume thing. Because when you start pushing up more gain in the speaker, then you start pushing in more Fletcher-Munson aspects. So now the low end has more energy or sounds fuller. The high mids become a little bit more present, and the high frequency air kind of comes up more. And you're just kind of playing into that. So on top of the boosting, you're ending up with other things that are going on. So let's just say, for example, I now throw let's just say I throw a limiter on here. So what I'll do is I have like a little mastering preset. There you go. You got my mastering settings now. So let's just say that I want to compress this a bit. I want to make sure that my gain structure is such that more or less what I'm getting is a very similar gain. So now if I want to hear the difference between the EQ and compression without it, so if anything, it's like I'm undercompensating for gain. So let me just kind of make up a little bit for this here. This way I can get a true judgment of what's going on. And it also preserves some of the gain structure. So as I'm working here, now what ends up happening, because I set my input gain structure well, as I'm now working here, I try to make it more or less as a rule that I never find my fader above 0 or kind of down below like -30. And a little bit of this is a habit that stems from working in the analog and analog consoles, because what happens is that if you start looking at, and this happens earlier on in analog gear, what happens is the scale of the fader starts to change. So if you see here the difference, the actual measured difference in centimeters or millimeters or inches or whatever you want to put it, that distance there, that defined distance is 6 dB, and then that's doubled there. But now the distance from here is a little bit shorter, right? And it's 5 dB. That's 5 dB. Now that same distance that was 5 dB is now 10. Oh, well, that's also 5 dB and 5 dB, but now it's 10 dB down here. So in other words, the scale is not linear on the actual fader itself. So the actual velocity that you end up moving the fader, the gain actually changes underneath the rate at which you're moving, or the vector in the way that you're moving. What happens on most analog faders and automation systems is that the faders are scaled so they're more or less linear within a certain portion of the fader, plus minus, and then they start to become nonlinear. And so the accuracy of your automation in those areas becomes less accurate. Now, I don't necessarily do it for that, but if I'm running proper gain staging through plugins, then what ends up happening is I may pull a clave or a hi-hat or something that's loud or a cymbal down to like -20, okay, because that may be where it appropriately fits within the mix. You could see here, now my mix is kind of skewed because of what I had here, but even just setting this up, you see that most of my faders, none of them are above 0, and that's not like a hard rule. I generally find like when I'm pushing above 0, if I've set my gain structure right, I end up, if I don't, rather, or whatever, if I push it up above 0, I often find that I'm just pushing the mix bus and the stems too loud, right? So I want to take a look here at my gain structure through the stems. And so just in the same way that I was let's just see if I can move this out here. Let's see if I can slide this guy over. So now if I put this guy on the mix bus,
just feet apart, not recognizing the reflection of a superstar.
And this is almost all this energy is driven by drums. I'm actually not far off.
It's just what we have to do to just claim the fame. Ain't no stopping.
All right, so there's you can see where I'm pushing it a little bit, but that's like pretty good. If you went into an analog tape at that gain, then you'd be pretty good. Let's take a look at what it's like after my compression. So you can see the compression is taking up some of those peaks, but more or less the gain is pretty similar or pretty much the same on the VU meter. Now, you can have a couple that are floating around like this. I don't want to get you into this idea where you're obsessing about it too much. The one thing I will say about monitoring gain is generally during the mix process, you'll have options where you can, and it's different with every application, where the meter can be pre-fader metering or post-fader metering. In Pro Tools, the pre-fader metering is pre-fader, but it is post-processing. So as I'm adding gain with plugins, that's showing up on the meter. You have to check the specifications of your particular application, but if it's post, then it's showing you the level after the fader. That's almost not really important as long as you're not pushing faders above 0, which is part of the reason why I don't do it. It keeps me from having to switch back and forth. I don't want to be kind of driving too much level through a channel into a stem unnecessarily. There are exceptions to this, because as you're going through stuff, you may want to drive the gain of a distortion plugin or something, or you may want to overdrive the input of a particular piece of gear. Quite often, though, especially with analog gear, those gain stages are built in for you to drive that in. And if not, then like an example of this would be something like let's just see, from the Waves world, would be something like the Shep 73, where, and a lot of plugins have this, like actually Slate is very good with this, where they kind of built in these things where you can use a drive function, like you're driving a line level signal into a mic preamp type of thing, or you're driving more level into the preamp stage. What they do here with Waves is they set it up so you get the tonal coloration without the actual extra gain added in. So you'll notice a little bit more low end energy here, and the harmonics will shift up higher as you go up higher along the way. And that allows you to create a subtle tonal shift that comes within the gear. But when you're operating it and you're working with it, the plugin is optimized for those gains, because those are the gains that are running through the analog gear as they're doing all the testing. And so when you're doing that, by setting up this gain staging prior, you're actually maximizing the usability of your analog plugins, because what quite often happens is people's gain structure is so out of whack, too low or too high. By the time they run into an analog piece of gear, you're running into an 1176, an LA2A or something, and the gain structure is so far off that the plugin itself is giving you, it's mapping out how that would operate if you were feeding that much gain into it, and now you're not running in the optimal range of its efficiency, and therefore it's not going to give you the results probably that you're looking for, and it's not going to sound as similar. That subtle thing makes a huge difference over the course of an entire mix, and that's the reason why I say this. This is like such an important part, and this type of thing where you think it may be like do I really want to spend time like going through and gain structuring each of the plugins or each track? And if you do this as you kind of go along, like if you're working on the production and you just kind of gain stage things, even if you record it at one level, import the sample, edit it, bring it in, but then adjust the gain so you get an optimal kind of range, when you go to mix, it's all set up and you just kind of roll with it. You could just kind of move right along. And it makes everything so fluid and so active when you start working with plugins, because they're all calibrated in some way, shape, or form this way. you have to go through the specifications, like a lot of the universal audio gear. Some of it is calibrated at -12. Some of it's calibrated at -14, at -18. So you may get some variation with it. Like the Kramer tape, I think, was calibrated at -14, which is an operating level I used to use a lot because I found that -20, which was the standard like in the 80s and 90s, for a lot of recordings, digital recordings, for most rock music and pop music, which doesn't have a lot of performance dynamic built into it, or not as much, it would, I wouldn't be able, I wasn't getting enough out of it. All my levels would be at like -18. I'd be like, there's like no gain here. I want to get more of the bit structure, especially at 16-bit recording, which a lot of those, late 80 recordings, like a 24-bit was more of like a mid 90s kind of advancement in terms of multi-track recording. So when you got 16-bit, you want to make use of every single bit, so you calibrate the input-output stage, and that's where all that comes from. And it plays into everything. Very important. That's why I've spent so much time in this, and I think it's really an important one to understand. So and if you kind of can wrap your head around this and grasp this, then it's going to make the rest of the process and everything else that you do so much simpler. All right, so there's a fundamentals of mixing, lesson number 11, gain structure of a mix.